Hi, I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, with the update for Day 30, the penultimate day of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings. Today we heard from 4 witnesses in 2 batches. We heard from Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Minister of Finance, and we heard from a panel of 3 people from the Prime Minister's office. I'll start with summarizing or going through some of the highlights of Ms. Freeland's evidence, and then I'll just have a couple notes about the evidence from the Prime Minister's office. I have 3 highlights I want to talk about with respect to Minister Freeland's evidence. The first one, under cross-examination by the CCLA, she was confronted with other protests that are comparable to the Freedom Convoy protest, which were supported not by her alone, but by Western democracies generally speaking. So, for example, she's confronted with an example where a port was blockaded in Poland, presumably it wasn't a situation I was familiar with, but presumably before the fall of communism. And given that that's generally seen as a positive thing, she was asked about how she would square her support for that protest with her disapproval of this one. And essentially her answer boiled down to that was a protest against an illegitimate authoritarian regime. It was the people rising up, whereas this was a protest against a democratically elected government. She was also asked a very pointed question by counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation about economic harm. So as the Minister of Finance, one of the things she talked about quite a bit was the economic harm to Canada and how that factored into the decision to declare an emergency. And so she was asked very straightforwardly and multiple times in an attempt to get an answer from her by counsel for the CCF whether economic harm fell under 2C, that definition that we've heard a lot about threats to the security of Canada based on threats of serious harm, or serious violence, sorry. And she was asked multiple times, she wouldn't say, and eventually it came down to an objection that was venturing into legal argument. And then the third point I wanted to raise from her evidence came out from her cross-examination by Alan Honor for the Democracy Fund, where he went through a series of documents relating to phone conversations and discussions that were had with American officials, and confronted her with the idea that the pressure from the federal government to declare the emergency was motivated by pressure that was coming from the United States. For a bit of context, we have seen a readout from a call with Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Ford on the 9th, where Prime Minister Trudeau said that he didn't think extra legal tools were necessary because the protesters were breaking the law. We know there was a series of discussions with American officials, including a call between Trudeau and Biden over the next few days, and then the declaration of emergency happened on the 14th. And then just really quickly, a summary, or not a summary, just a couple highlights from the evidence from the Prime Minister's office. Kara Zwiebel for the CCLA asked if there were discussions about the government toning down its rhetoric and communicating that it had heard the protesters, so taking a shift in tactic. And Brian Clow, one of the panelists, answered that there were constant discussions about it, but given the protesters' demands and the fact that the government wouldn't change the vaccine mandate, they didn't think it would help. And just another highlight from Alan Honor for the Democracy Fund. He took the panel to documents showing American support for the Freedom Convoy, including a letter, or actually opposing the protests opposing the mandates more specifically. So that, for example, they were shown a letter signed by, I believe it was 16 governors from the United States, as well as the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan here in Canada. And they were asked about how that kind of a message would make it to the Prime Minister. So those are the highlights for today. Tune in for the final update tomorrow as we deal with the only remaining witness in the hearings, Prime Minister himself. Thanks, and I'll talk to you then.